Hi, my name's Adam Tapp, and I had a near-death experience February 28th, 2018, where I was electrocuted to death, and I was dead for around 11 and a half minutes before being resuscitated. And this is my story. So I know I've been a paramedic for 20 years now, and I do a lot of woodworking, which I find cathartic, and it's a form of, I guess, emotional release to some extent. And I was doing sort of a technique of wood etching called a Lichtenberg device, where you take a microwave transformer and basically strip every possible safety feature from it and hook it up to a wall, 110 volts AC, and it basically turns it into 12,000 volts DC. And this highly dangerous machine basically etches these interesting coral patterns into wood. And so I was with a good friend of mine, and we had had a beer, and we were sitting by my shop, and we were etching this piece of wood. And conveniently enough, he had taken a high voltage safety course about 2 weeks before, which is profoundly convenient for a number of different reasons. And I remember I was talking to him, and I was moving the electrodes one by one, and it just arced into my hand. And it was just this snap from reality. It was almost overwhelming. It was like this intense level of absolute pain. Like every single cell in my body was being pulled into pieces. And it was overwhelming to a point where I didn't understand what was happening. It was almost as if everything had shut down, and it was just everything in my vision was these vertical cylinders. They were sort of this iridescent green that went up and down forever. I remember trying to focus a thought amongst the energy, and I think it was like I'm being electrocuted. And then I think I thought I'm falling, and I felt like I was falling for ages. And then it was just like waking up from a nap someplace that I'd always been. It was this perfect inky blackness. It was almost like deep space, where it was like there's lights in the distance, like these twinkling stars to some extent, but it was just this perfect blackness. I was like I was seeing spherically from a single point outwards. Like I had just become a single point of awareness. And I wasn't Adam, I wasn't dead, I wasn't anything. I was just perfect, like absolute contentment. And I was just in this space for time. Like there was no sense of consistency with anything. It was just simply existing as awareness. And then I felt sort of this frequency start washing over me, and it was like it was like this fractal patterns, and it was like gasoline on water, this rainbow effect. It was iridescent to some extent, and it was just this juxtaposition of thoughts and feelings and emotions. And I felt myself sort of being pulled into pieces and deposited into everything. It was like basically becoming fabric of the universe. And it was absolutely perfect. Like there was no fear, there was nothing. This was just the natural progression of what every single one of us is going to do, just back to the source, back to this infinite consciousness or infinite complexity. And then all of a sudden I started being electrocuted again. And at the time, I didn't understand what was happening. But in hindsight, it was me being defibrillated. I was defibrillated twice. I was in a ventricular fibrillation arrhythmia, which is basically the heart spasming. And so I was defibrillated. And the defibrillation takes 0.5 seconds, but this was like minutes, if I can even say that, of being electrocuted again. And then all of a sudden it stopped. And now I'm aware that I'm Adam, that I'm dead, that I've been electrocuted. And now I'm in this void of just a being. And it was a really long time that I was just there, maybe coming to terms with who and what I was and myself and my place in the universe. And then I started being electrocuted again, which again was the second defibrillation. And I remember myself being pulled perhaps out or some variation of that. And then I think I maybe at one point acknowledged the smell of burnt flesh, which would have been my hands. My finger was burned off, and I had third-degree burns all over this hand. And I was in a coma for about 8 hours, which was fine for me, but problematic for everyone else who thought I was brain dead. And, I remember waking up in the ICU when I was intubated, tube into my lungs, and I had an interosseous needle drilled into my shoulder bone. Like my first thought was, how long has it been? And I remember like sort of being able to write something down. My hands were all bandaged, and they said it's like 8 hours or something. And it blew my mind. Like if someone had told me it had been 5 years or a decade, I would have been completely on point with that. But what was unique about the experience is after I was extubated and, hugs from everyone and whatnot, I remember like looking at myself and I could smell myself, and not body odor in the sense of need to put deodorant on, but my natural pheromonal smell that we all have because we're primates. We just go to great lengths to hide it. but I was so hyper aware of my smell and the texture of my skin. And I felt so deeply that I just got downgraded from this Cray supercomputer to this Commodore 2000, this pixelated screen. And that stuck with me for a long time. Like it was like months of just feeling this way. And I remember saying to my wife, like, this isn't real. Like, this isn't real. And I was a little alarmed by that. But eventually it just came back to the acceptance of being in my body and being in this space. But, I was left with this overwhelming sense that this is just a stage. This is simply an evolution of consciousness. This is simply transient where we exist right now. And, there wasn't any anthropomorphic figures or people in robes. It was just simply going back to the source of everything, which is this infinite consciousness that permeates everything. Simply the space between subatomic particles is consciousness. And, I didn't want to read anything about other people's near-death experiences, but I didn't want it to change my interpretation of what had happened to me. But, I had the traditional photophobia where I was going all Corey Hart wearing sunglasses at all times of day. Like it was even the light inside a house would just almost be blinding to me. And another interesting thing too is that the burns on my hands actually accelerated healing. I was told I would need skin grafts. And in a very short period of time, everything revascularized and started healing, which was interesting. That I can't necessarily state that that's a consistency amongst people with NDEs, but it was very much this process of getting used to what I have to call a monkey suit now, because it very much is. It's a limiting filter in which I currently exist in, the limitations of my biology. But at the same time, it's so deeply beautiful that I can simply just experience emotions and feelings. But the one thing that I took from all of this was in that place, when I was devoid of a body, I was very, very highly aware of the amount of anxiety, the amount of weird emotions that riff and sift through us on any specific moment, the biological mechanisms, the hormones that make us do things. It was a state of absolute tranquility. And it was one of those things when I was back in my body of just feeling these emotions come up and not necessarily knowing what to do with them, because it seemed that I just completely disconnected from everything that is this biological mechanism of the atom, and now was back into this fold. I started doing psychedelics subsequently afterwards, and I feel that the very nature of death experiences is so integrally related to these psychedelic compounds and dimethyltryptamine in our bodies and in our brains responsible for dreaming and death. And I feel that the experience itself has made me so deeply spiritual. I think I was superficially spiritual before, in the sense that we just trivially use the word, without necessarily understanding the deeper meaning behind it. But it's almost like experiencing infinite consciousness and becoming part of it, and then coming back to this and still having that awareness, the awareness that we're just part of something that is so profoundly complicated, so infinitely perfect. So I think something to take away from all of this, or something that I've noticed has changed in me and my personality, is my ability to just simply appreciate a moment, as opposed to applying meaning to everything or plans or language. Is simply able to be in a space and appreciate what's going on. I notice that with my daughter a lot, just simply being in a space and enjoying every moment of it. And, one thing I also want to mention in this is the similarities to psychedelic experiences and being dead. One could arguably suggest that my death experience was just an endogenous dimethyltryptamine release, which is commonly referred to as NNDMT. And subsequent psychedelic experiences have been death. They've been versions of this. They've arguably been more profound than death actually was. And I think that at the end of the day, the one thing that I would say to someone if they ask me what I took from this or the advice associated with it is that death is quite possibly the most natural thing that happens. Being dead was easy. It was perfect. It was beautiful. It's being alive that's difficult and hard. And I think that death in itself is just simply a transition. It's becoming infinite. It's becoming the fabric of the universe. It's being perfect. One could argue that we're all perfect already, but we just refuse to acknowledge that. And being death was just absolute perfection. And I think that, the common fear that we all have is our mortality. And it's understandable. It's genetically motivated. If we didn't have a fear of death, we wouldn't be a species that we are today. But again, death just was simply perfection. It was becoming everything. And it was perfect. And I think that it's made me spiritual in a sense. I think before I was spiritual, but superficially, whereas now it seems that spirituality has taken on a very significant depth in me, where I viscerally know what we all are and where we're all going. And that does alleviate a lot of the fear that we all exist with on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, I guess to summarize everything up was being dead was a state of absolute perfection.